What's up, everyone? Welcome to the Normal Christians Podcast. My name is Bo. As always, I reserve the right to get smarter. And let's jump into something that I came across that piqued my interest. That was a little bit before my time, but I certainly have heard about it before and remember aspects of it. But really, let's just talk about this depressing subject because really that's what everybody wants to start their week, right? We just want some good depressing topic that makes us introspective and really makes us question everything. Isn't that why you decided to listen today? All the joy that I could bring you through pure sadness and sad topics. Well, if you are, I'm glad you joined. Love it. No. Anyway, but it is a little bit depressing whenever you think about it, and we're going to talk about eugenics. Such an exciting topic, and it's actually pretty sad, but really what spurred this on was I came across two different articles. One in the New York Times titled, "You Just Feel Like Nothing, California to Pay Sterilization Victims," and another in the New Yorker titled, "The Forgotten Lessons of the American Eugenics Movement." And the New Yorker article, I think, was from 2017, and the New York Times one was just published, which kind of grabbed my attention. Anyway, a little bit in the way of definitions here. If you don't know, eugenics is the practice or advocacy of improving the human species by selectively mating people with specific desirable hereditary traits. It aims to reduce human suffering by, quote-unquote, breeding out disease, disabilities, and so-called undesirable characteristics from the human population. And that, I believe, was from a definition from history. Or anything like that. And so New Yorker, I'm reading from the New Yorker here, talking about eugenics and a little bit of how it came about. It says, a sloppy reading of Gregor Mendel's pea pods and Charles Darwin's theories gave a scientific veneer to the conclusion that many social ills were caused by the proliferation of the wrong sort of people and that they could be neatly nipped in the bud with the intervention of eugenics, a term coined in 1883 by Darwin's half-cousin Francis Galton, who declared it, quote, a virile creed of hopelessness, end quote. Butchered that word there. That's my bad. Soon, the United States, along with Germany, was at the forefront of the movement to improve the human species through breeding. And then the New York Times says, under the influence of a movement known as eugenics, whose supporters believed that those with physical disabilities, psychiatric disorders, and other conditions were genetically defective. More than 60,000 people across the United States were forcibly sterilized by state-run programs through the 20th century. So that gives you a little bit of what eugenics is, in case you didn't know, but it also gives you a little bit of where it came from, a little bit having its roots in a little bit of Darwin's theories, a little bit of Mendel's work. New Yorker makes it clear, a misreading of those sort of things. But you could see, if you believe a pure naturalism, how you arrive where people arrived, where if you have all these disabilities, these diseases, these things that society looks at as wrong or not great, well, let's just work those out of the system. Let's keep people from mating and passing on those genes there. And by the way, this is not a statement against evolution or for evolution or anything like that, but I'm just going to say, from a purely naturalistic perspective and worldview maybe even, you can see how that conclusion is arrived at. And then from the New Yorker, it actually talks about a case in the Supreme Court, Buck versus Bell, which in an 8-1 decision made forced sterilization for eugenic purposes legal in the United States. Going forward a bit, Oliver Wendell Holmes was on the court when the case was tried and wrote the majority opinion, and this, I believe, is a quote from that opinion. It is better for the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or to let them starve for their impeccability, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind, end quote. He declared in reference to Carey's family, who was, I believe, the defendant in this case, that they were, quote, 3 generations of imbeciles. And he says three generations of imbeciles are enough, end quote. And woo, man, it's crazy reading that and thinking that that was this century, and that was a Supreme Court case and everything like that. So to talk about how it's better for the world, instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for a crime or to let them starve, that they can prevent it by sterilization, by keeping them from, in essence, breeding and passing along their genes. I mean, just crazy sort of stuff. But at the heart of the issue for me is just this belief that society, cultures, and others get to decide who is valuable and who is not. I think that that's a crazy sort of thing that, again, reading from that judge's opinion, I mean, talking about the offspring of degenerates as if because they have parents who made poor choices or who have less desirable traits, to put it in the language that would have probably been used there, what they deemed less desirable traits, well, those people shouldn't have offspring, or those offspring should be sterilized themselves, or something of that nature, because, well, rather get on the forefront than have to execute them or push them away. And I know that, that's certainly not a lot of what's happening now, clearly, but still, this idea, it's just so staggering to me. Again, society, culture, just people deciding, oh, this is valuable, or you're less valuable because of this, and so we're going to take away something like your ability to have kids, or you have kids, and all that's gets forcibly sterilized at a young age. It's just nuts. I mean, that's the heart of the issue, again, to me, that this idea that people should be able to make that decision about others, it's just, I don't know, it's just nuts. And as we think back, especially in this current cultural climate, we all like to look down our nose at Nazis. And actually, let me just clarify that we should all look down on Nazis. This isn't some sort of defense of it's just a cultural thing. What they did was terrible, so rightfully so, and all of that. But the reason I say that is because if you're looking at this eugenics movement and when it happened, we were actually pretty much lockstep with Germany in this whole idea about needing to weed out different people from society. As a matter of fact, another quote from the New Yorker, a biologist named Harry Laughlin corresponded with German eugenics and was enthusiastic about Hitler's leadership, praising him for realizing that the, quote, this is a quote here, central mission of all politics is race hygiene, end quote. He was also a driving force behind the Immigration Act of 1924, which set strict quotas on various undesirable races, including Jews. He urged maintaining these quotas when, not many years later, large number of Jews were trying to flee Europe. And it's just unbelievable sort of stuff. Again, we're able to look back on history and see this just terrible sort of thing. And I don't want to get into all of World War II here and some of that stuff, but man, it's bad. It's crazy to me, again, that you had this whole movement where people could just look down on others and say, those are desirable traits, those aren't. And it's actually not that long ago that all this happened in the grand scheme of things. Again, past century. And before you think, oh, well, all right, Bo, look, there's always been nut jobs, right? There's always been crazy people on the fringe who do these things. But not only did I just read a Supreme Court decision, but also from the New Yorker, they had this. Scientific American ran articles on the subject of eugenics, and the American Museum of Natural History hosted conferences. Theodore Roosevelt, Alexander Graham Bell, John D. Rockefeller Jr., and many other prominent citizens were outspoken supporters. Eugenics was taught in schools, celebrated in exhibits at the World Fair, and even preached from pulpits. Oof. The human race, one prominent advocate declared in 1909, was poised to, this is a quote, to dry up the springs that feed the torrent of defective and degenerate protoplasm, end quote. And then from the New York Times, In 1924, I believe this is the New York Times, yeah, the forward thinkers of America were preoccupied by the imagined genetic threat of feeble-mindedness, a condition defined, well, now I'm butchering the quote here. They were also preoccupied with condition that was diagnosed, often using flawed intelligence tests. Boy, all right. Whew, speaking of beginning of the week, I'm struggling through that article right there. Whew, let's just restart here. After reading from the New Yorker, jumping to the New York Times here, in 1924, the forward thinkers of America were preoccupied by the imagined genetic threat of feeble-mindedness, which was this condition that was diagnosed by flawed intelligence tests and by identifying symptoms such as moral degeneracy, and overactive sex drive, and other traits liberally ascribed to poor people, in quotes, especially poor women, who were seen as having stepped out of line. So those two kind of give you a hint of this isn't some fringe issue. This was mainstream. These were big thinkers and big-time names who were all on board with this. And I mean, it was being promoted in Scientific American, and then from that last paragraph that I absolutely butchered, you had all these forward thinkers who were trying to get out feeble-mindedness, which is just nonsense. Basically, they saw traits in people doing actions, and they thought, well, it certainly has to be this, so let's just cut it out. Let's do these sort of things. But I think the line that stuck out to me the most from the New Yorker was this last line. The human race, one prominent advocate declared in 1909, was poised, and this was the quote, to dry up the springs that feed the torrent of defective and degenerate protoplasm. But that defective and degenerate, that thinking right there is just so dangerous, and it's just so crazy to me that this type of thinking affected people. It infected, I guess I should say, people's minds, and some of the great thinkers where they would look down on people and say, well, your actions are defective. You are a degenerate. Therefore, we need to take action in this sort of way. Which, look, some actions are bad. We get that. Some things are far from desirable. But then to take that and go, well, we got to keep these people from breeding because they have quote-unquote feeble-mindedness or whatever the excuse is, to basically sterilize these people. And as you could kind of figure out as you start to read and listen to this stuff, the rich and the powerful certainly weren't the ones getting sterilized. They certainly weren't the ones having to deal with the consequences of these actions. No, of course they were good, and they were far doing it to all these other poor or disenfranchised or these other people. And so this really begins to affect kind of the suspects you would think it would affect the most. I probably don't even have to get into it without some of these popping into your mind. The New Yorker, for instance, highlighted so many poor Southerners underwent the procedure, sterilization, that it became known as, quote-unquote, a Mississippi appendectomy. I mean, whew, it's the poor, right? It's the disabled, it's different races, it's foreigners, and just people who were different from those who were at the top, or those who were elite, or those who were in power. And again, we're just not that far away from this type of thinking. And before you think, yeah, well, you're right, it's not that far, but whew, luckily we don't deal with that sort of stuff. Well, got a little surprise for you. Once again from the New Yorker. In 2013, the Center for Investigative Reporting revealed that at least 148 female prisoners in California were sterilized without proper permission between 2006 and 2010. Last year, a district attorney in Nashville was fired for including sterilization requirements in plea deals, and that last year would have been 2016. So you see some instances of this creeping up in the 2000s, as recently, at least that I have here, as 2016, it making an appearance. And this is all terrible, but any sort of issue like this, it's bad enough. But what just takes it to a whole nother level of being terrible is when you really begin to put some skin on the issue. In other words, whenever you begin to see actual people who were affected by this in their story. And so from the New York Times, one person was highlighted, Leonard Bisel. I'm sure I butchered that. As you can figure out, I'm terrible with names. Bisel. Anyway, he was 15 when the state of California decided that he should not have children, threatening to lock him up and force him to do hard labor if he did not submit to sterilization. In the middle of his operation, recalled Leonard, now 88, he woke up. It was really painful, he said, and the doctor just told him to shut up. Bisel ended up in an institution called Sonoma State Home in Eldridge, California. After his father died, his mother had been previously institutionalized and was unable to take care of him. He said he felt he had no choice but to submit to sterilization. On his medical forms, he was labeled as quote-unquote dull. Records show that Bisel's mother was also sterilized at the same institution. And here's a quote from him. "You just feel like nothing. You're not worth anything." And now it does update you that he now lives in Selah, Washington. He married, he adopted 2 daughters, and now has 6 grandkids. So a little bit of a happy ending to his story. But what a powerful line, right? You just feel like nothing, that you're not worth anything. And the New York Times also highlighted this. In North Carolina, the first state to pay reparations for the decades-long eugenics program, a significant number of forcibly sterilized people were black women like Elaine Reddick, now 67. She was 13 when she was raped, she said, and at 14, as she gave birth to her son, the state sterilized her without her knowledge. In the paperwork, she was called, quote-unquote, feeble-minded. She did not find out until she was older, married, and trying to get pregnant. And this is a quote from her. "That's a very painful thing to find out, that your government allowed this to happen to you. For them to go inside of you and wreck the inside of your body at such a young, tender age, my body wasn't even developed." So it's just sad stuff. You get 2 different examples. One, an older male, an older white male. The other, now an older black female, but both at young ages getting sterilized. One without her knowledge at all. It's just terrible. Thankfully, these practices have stopped. But let's be honest, there's a real issue underneath this whole thing. And honestly, that's just hate. And it's just this hate for differences and people who are different. Especially, let me just highlight this, especially for those who have a disability. I even saw, I wish I could find it again. I've never been able to find it, but I watched this video, and I don't know if it was from Finland or some very progressive Nordic country, and I'm not trying to hate on progressiveness there, but just it was a progressive movement that was going on in the country that was trying to deal with, whatever that country was, how do you deal with people with mental handicaps? And it was just it seemed almost like a joke, this video, because you had this guy who had a board and he was writing out what the cost of basically a person was within the society. And when he got to people who had mental handicaps, the cost was much higher. And so he was breaking down how dealing with mental handicaps, it's better in some sense for them not to be there. In a way, I know this sounds terrible, but this was a real thing that I watched. And actually there was a reporter, and there was even a mentally challenged person, mentally handicapped person in the room while this was happening. And so this wasn't as much with eugenics as it had to do with euthanasia and being able to open up the doors for people to take their own, to have their own life taken. And the point was that there needs to be an opening for people with mental handicaps and that sort of thing to be able to have their life taken from them of their own choice, because there was an actual benefit for them to have that option, because it would, in essence, help that society. Those people were more of a burden on society, and it's just so sad. I struggle talking about that, and that video always stuck out in my mind because I thought, what am I watching? Is this some dystopian sort of film? But really, that's the issue. It's this hate. It's this fear of people who are different, who have differences. And just going, my frame of reference is the correct frame of reference. And if I'm in power, if I'm good, well, this is how life should look. It should look this way. People should act this way. All those sort of things. And in the New York Times, this is actually one last quote from the New York Times that I think kind of reinforces this and maybe even drives this home in some way. The quote is, "There's still a great amount of prejudice against people with disabilities and assumptions that they are, in the most extreme form, not worthy of life, not worthy of being born, and certainly not worthy of parenting," said Alexander Stern, a University of Michigan professor who is an expert on eugenics and reproductive rights. So I just think it's so sad, especially when we're talking about disabilities. Now, it's sad across the board, but what you're having right now is you're having, at least for us currently and culturally, you are having the conversation that isn't around eugenics per se, but you're definitely having a conversation about people with disabilities and people with birth defects, and what does that mean, and should their lives be terminated through abortion or, in different countries, euthanasia and different things like that. And I think Alexandria Stern's comment about prejudice against people with disabilities and this most extreme form of the prejudice where they're not worthy of life, not being born, and certainly not worth being parenting. I mean, that's one of the big things that you'll hear with abortion is understanding beforehand that the child will have these disabilities and these birth defects, and women getting pushed to terminate that pregnancy. Now, of course, it's under the guise of, well, the child won't have a good life, and it would be very difficult and burdensome. But this is it. It turns into, well, that human being who will be born is not worthy of life. Again, so sad once you think about everything. But for Christians, this sort of stuff, I don't know, to me it's particularly jarring, especially when you start talking about disabilities and that nature. It just breaks my heart. I really struggle with a lot of the conversations surrounding that sort of stuff now. But it just really shows, I think, that we have to be people of love, right? And we have to love everyone, and we have to not be judgmental. Now, that certainly doesn't mean that we have to agree with anything or everything that someone does. But if we're talking about things like disabilities or other things that people don't control or all that sort of stuff, depending on what it is, again, this is where I start treading in different waters here. But we just don't have an excuse to not love people. And even as I add those qualifications, we should love everybody, period. Again, we don't have to love what people do. We don't have to love their stances or their beliefs, but you still love the person. And I know for me, my journey, I'm in my mid-30s right now. Certainly growing up, I didn't really make fun of people or joke with people. But deep down, I'd certainly had judgments against people. And I would certainly look at people doing things and say, oh, this and that, or well, how could they do that? Or, oh, of course, it's this person or that thing. Whatever it was, I had judgments. And for years, I've been working more and more now on getting that out of my system, not even it being a reflex. Even recently, I was driving down the road and I saw an individual in a certain situation that I know I would have had judgment for previously. And I was able in my heart just to be able to say, man, God bless that person. I hope that thing is all right in that sort of thing there. And it just caught me off guard because that's what I've been working on. And this isn't a yay is me thing. It's more of an honesty of I used to be a lot more judgmental. Again, I wouldn't express it. And I feel like we're all judgmental in some sort of ways, but working hard to not have my reaction to be, whether it be people different from me, who live different ways of life, who think differently, who whatever the differences are, not having my reaction be one of hate, one of just pushing people away, whatever it is, to be able to say the words like I highlighted earlier, where defective and degenerate, people would look at him and say, oh, that's a defective person. There's something wrong with them. Well, there's something wrong with all of us according to the Bible, right? We all are sinners. We all fall short of the glory of God. We are all broken, honestly, beyond what we could ever understand, especially when it comes to our spiritual and this, what sin has done to us and what it is in our hearts. The heart is deceptive or deceitful above all things. Who could know it? Now, again, we don't have to agree with everything, but we should be people of love. And I know I was meeting with someone as I record this day before yesterday, a couple days ago. And this person's not a Christian, and they certainly have been through things and have much different views than me. But it was a refreshing conversation, and this individual even said how he appreciated me having these conversations and not talking down to him, or not just it always being some sort of preaching at him or gospel session here, even though we talk about different things. And again, this isn't a yay as me, but this is something I've had to work on, to say this person's different. They've gone through some things and they certainly have different views than me, but I need to love them. Whether we ever come to agreement on some very major things, whether I ever see this person come to Christ or I am able to walk him through that process, he still deserves love. Why? We always have to go back. Every single person is made in the image of God. Every single person. Every single person. This is so big. Doesn't matter if they're disabled. Doesn't matter if there's something wrong with them. That's still an image bearer of God in some sort of way. That person's still made in the image of our loving God. And so what excuse do I have not to love them? Right? And this goes across the board, especially with a lot of cultural topics, a lot of cultural issues. We love to divide. We love to point out the differences and hate on those differences, whatever they are. And I just think that's sad, because there is a person underneath those differences. There's a person underneath those struggles or those disabilities or whatever's wrong. And I think you see, without the love of Christ, without this grounding in the first ethic of us being made in the image of God, that baseline truth, you can so easily slip into something like eugenics. You could so easily read and get caught up in naturalism and think, well, why isn't it better for society, for these people with these issues to not be here? Why shouldn't we stop them from passing on their genes whenever that might push this on or that sort of thing on? And it's just terrible. It's just terrible. And so when we look back and we think, how could we ever be there? First off, we're not that far removed from it. And as I just said, I watched a video of a country dealing with euthanasia and people with mental handicaps and the benefit of society if they weren't there and that sort of thing. These are very real things. And so Christians, we have to be loving people across differences, across disabilities, across the spectrum. Again, we're not agreeing with everything. We are still Christians. We're still followers of God, but that still doesn't give us any excuse not to show love, because what Christ died for us, right, when we were still enemies, when we were still against them in our sin. So we've got to love. We got to love. So try to end on a little bit of a higher note. Really sure you're glad you tuned in and got your week started off with some eugenics and some sad stories. So you're welcome. That's the kind of stuff that you could expect from this podcast and from me. But really, in all seriousness, thank you for taking the time and listening. As always, 3515. God bless. Have a good one. See you next time.